Lord Robertson, you're the former head of NATO, the NATO alliance. We're going to talk about Ukraine, obviously, today, and Russia. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to tell you that NATO is the most successful defence alliance that the world has ever seen. A group of independent, individual nations united in collective defence and determined that Russia won't win in Ukraine and that the Ukrainians will.
Lord Robertson, you were the 10th Secretary General of NATO. You were there between 1999 and 2003. You met Vladimir Putin 9 times, I believe, at the Kremlin and also in Brussels. And you also said you did good business with him. I mean, firstly, what is he like?
Well, I know what he was like, which was controlled, cool, but at the same time, remarkably chatty and talkative and communicative. In these days, I did good business with him. It was very businesslike. He wasn't into small talk, and any attempt at small talk was usually cut off. But so it was businesslike. But you're recognizing that he'd taken over after the chaos of Yeltsin and that period where Russia was really out of control. You could see that his brand of managerialism, KGB managerialism, had certain attractions. So, I found it easy to talk to him and to communicate with him and to get messages from him. But things have changed quite dramatically since then.
And when you say, you did good business with him, what are you referring to?
Well, we resumed NATO-Russia relations, which had been fractured by what we had to do in Kosovo. And therefore, we were talking to each other, but we were talking past each other at that time. So Putin came in and simply said, "I want to resume relations with NATO, step by step."
So it was him doing the movement there, or was it a mutual thing of you both approaching each other?
The relationship had been pretty well frozen. I think that's what you would describe it as. And the first move came from him. He'd not long taken over when a message came through that if we wanted to come to Moscow, then the answer would be yes. Now, that was a big change because up until then, they didn't want to know NATO at all, and their ambassador in NATO was pretty obstructive. He was an old cold warrior. So the signal that I got from Ambassador Kislyak was if you were to make an approach, it would be favourably received. So I suppose, yes, he decided that he was going to repair the relationship and try and, I think, from what he said, wanted to build a firmer relationship with NATO.
Because you also said that he even asked you about when you were going to invite Russia to join NATO. I mean, was he pulling your leg there? Because it seems that's quite a different Putin to the one we hear about now.
Well, it is a different Putin to the one we hear about now. But just go back a stage at the first meeting, because the "Are you going to invite us to join NATO?" came at the second meeting in Brussels. At the first meeting, Vladimir Putin clearly said, "I want Russia to be part of Western Europe. I believe that's our destiny." He said, these guys, waving to the guys at the end of the long table, said, he said, "They don't agree, but I want to do it." So that was the prelude. The second meeting, he said, "When are you going to invite Russia to join NATO?" No, it wasn't a leg pull. It was a serious question, but he already knew the answer. And they say in politics, you should never ask a question unless you already know the answer. So he did, but when I said we don't invite countries to join NATO, they apply to join NATO, he said, well, we're not standing in line with a lot of countries that don't matter.
Because the argument, I guess, you put forward and many others do is that Putin has changed, right? The man who you used to deal with has drastically changed in his thinking in the last 20 years. I think there are quite a lot of Russian experts who would say that idea that Putin in 2000 was some sort of reformer, some sort of Democrat, some sort of guy you can do business with is, well, ridiculous, that you've all been fooled. Do you think you were fooled by him, or you think that was a genuine attempt there to reach out to the West?
I have no doubt whatsoever that in these early days, he saw Russia as being part of that stable, controlled continent, which was more predictable than it had been for generations, if not for centuries. Now he changed over the years, but I think we had two choices at that time. One was to say he wants to be part of Europe. Let's bring him in. Do what the French did to Germany: tie them in iron hoops, so that they become part of Europe. That's what France has done with single currency, European Central Bank, the internal market. All of these things have been designed to make sure that Germany didn't do what Germany did twice to France. And we could have done that with Russia. The other alternative was to say that they were a danger and that we should have put up the barriers. We should have erected defences in order to protect ourselves from what Putin has maybe become. Now, we didn't really do either of them. I started to do the first, to sort of reach out and engage them in so many activities that they basically couldn't fight with us. But after I left NATO, the American administration, the Bush administration, lost any interest, basically, in doing business with Russia. They saw it as a threat, but they didn't really want to make it part of the overall partnership. I think we missed an opportunity at that time because I think it's what he wanted and we could have grabbed hold of him.
Do you put a blame then to his shift in thinking? If you go forward to 2008 when at the Bucharest summit, there was talk of allowing Georgia and Ukraine to eventually join NATO. Is that where you say the shift happened?
That was one of the shifts that took place and gave the wrong signals. But it was happening before that as well. Dick Cheney, the vice president, and Donald Rumsfeld, the American defense secretary, neither of them were convinced that they wanted to do business with Russia.
Other actions by the Russian government have been counterproductive and could begin to affect relations with other countries. No legitimate interest is served when oil and gas become tools of intimidation or blackmail, either by supply manipulation or attempts to monopolize transportation. And no one can justify actions that undermine the territorial integrity of a neighbor.
They've had long-standing hostility to Russia, to the Soviet Union. They were cold warriors, just like the gang who are around Putin today, and they soured that relationship.
Isn't the worry, though, that with that sort of thinking, that it leads to the inevitable conclusion that the current conflict is the fault of NATO and arguably the Americans, in your opinion?
No, he was to blame as well. I think gradually he began to get at this image of the greater Russia. The nature of the Rus, the ancient Rus, which encompassed the neighboring areas to Russia as well. So, isolated in the Kremlin or in the Dasha, he started to dream these dreams. So the war with Georgia took place, then the Bucharest summit stimulated a degree of problems. But remember, the biggest irritation to Putin was actually the European Union, not NATO. I think Putin thought he could deal with NATO. NATO was a military alliance. He was a military power. He had over 70,000 nuclear weapons. So NATO wasn't really a problem, isn't a problem for him. The European Union and the accession agreement that was offered to Ukraine, that was a problem because that would have changed his neighborhood quite dramatically and permanently, creating a democratic, prosperous, Western-orientated state right on Russia's borders and as part of the old Russian Empire that he wanted to recreate.
Before you became Secretary General at the end of 1999, Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic, as it was then, joined. And shortly after you left, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania joined. When you were having those conversations with Putin, what was he saying about that? The fact that those countries had just joined, the fact that certain countries were about to join. What was he saying then?
Nothing.
Nothing?
No, he didn't object at all. At no point did he raise the enlargement of NATO at all. And remember, it's not NATO expansion. It's a wrong word, because NATO enlarged, because countries applied for membership.
Why did those countries want to join, though? Because I guess the argument from the Lithuanias, Estonias, as it happens now, is they say, look, we've always said Russia were the threat. That's why we joined NATO years ago. Russia's always been the threat. Why do those countries want to join NATO, an alliance which was formed during the Cold War as an act of defence against Russia?
Because collective defence is better than individual defence. That's why we're in it. That's why NATO was created in the first place. It was collective defence. It happened to be at that time against the Soviet Union, but other countries have joined, and it gave them a degree of normalisation. Common procedures, common processes, common procurement, all of these things were involved on the defence side. So it complemented their movement towards the European Union as well. So they definitely wanted to do it. Eventually, of course, they realised as Putin became more and more aggressive. Indeed, at the Munich Security Conference where Putin spoke, I think it was a Lithuanian minister who got up and said, "Thank you to Putin for his really aggressive speech." He said, "I want to thank you because you've reminded all of us of why we wanted to join NATO."
And before the Russian invasion this year, before the annexation of Crimea, given that NATO was founded in the Cold War in 1949, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did it lose briefly its purpose?
That's a good question. And it's a question that was asked and is constantly asked. But after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, and the announcement that the Soviet Union ceased to exist was made at a meeting of the North Atlantic Consultative Council when they had a break for lunch, and the Soviet ambassador came back in the afternoon and reported that his country no longer existed. But it was felt at that time that these countries of the Warsaw Pact needed some help to make the transition from military control of the military, from being part of the Warsaw Pact into being democratic countries where civilian control of the military was mattering. So the Partnership for Peace was created, including Russia and Ukraine. The Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council was created. I used to chair it. I used to sit with 46 countries round one table, both at heads of state level as well as ambassadorial level, with Russia and Ukraine round the table, with Armenia and Azerbaijan, who are technically still at war. And I kept thinking, this is the most boring meeting that I could possibly be chairing, but it's better than the Third World War. So, we bridged that period from the old Cold War of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union versus NATO and the West into the new world where these countries wanted to become part of a collective security organization. As I say, at every one of these meetings, Russia was present, Russia was participating.
So when Russia invaded Ukraine in February this year, were you surprised then?
It was as sudden as it was brutal and relentless. Ukrainians woke up to find themselves plunged into the midst of war. Explosions and air raid sirens ringing out here in Kyiv and cities across this country as Russia launched a full-scale invasion on multiple fronts in the early hours of this morning.
I was surprised and I was sickened because I thought that this was a betrayal of the United Nations Charter, of the Helsinki Accords, of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, of the Rome Declaration, of the Budapest Memorandum. All of these things had been betrayed by the fact that Putin was invading a sovereign nation state. He stood beside me on the 28th of May, 2002, just about the same distance as we are apart today, and said Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation state which will make its own decisions about its security arrangements. That was when we created the NATO-Russia Council. And he said that explicitly. And he signed a declaration that day that actually said that countries had the right to make their own decisions.
To critics who would say you should never have believed him, what would you say?
Well, I don't think that is right, because there were people in Moscow who didn't believe they were going to invade. People who told me that it was simply muscle flexing to put the troops round there. And it may be, you know, I hold a view that not everybody shares, that maybe we provoked him into making that ultimate decision. Because we kept saying, our government, the American government, other people kept saying, we know you're going to invade, you're going to invade, you're going to invade. We said it over and over again. And a very senior Russian who was in London before the invasion said to me quietly, he said, you know, he said, if they keep saying that, every day he doesn't invade, he loses a bit of credibility.
What do you make of NATO's response since the invasion?
Peace on our continent has been shattered. We now have war in Europe on a scale and of a type we thought belonged to history. This is a grave moment for the security of Europe.
You know, obviously NATO has been supportive of Ukraine. It hasn't got involved in the conflict. Would you have done anything differently if you were still Secretary General?
No, I wouldn't. And I strongly support and stand by Secretary General Stoltenberg and what he's done. He's kept the alliance together. That was very important. He's enlarged the alliance. You know, I tried for 4 years to get Finland and Sweden, you know, to join NATO. Vladimir Putin managed it in 4 weeks. So, you know...
What were they saying to you back then about not joining?
Well, they wanted to be non-aligned and didn't want to provoke Russia, you know, and they had a long tradition of so-called neutrality, although I kept telling them what were they neutral about. But, you know, there was a reluctance.
How important has NATO support, the weapons it gives, the training it gives, to the recent counteroffensive by Ukraine?
I think it's been invaluable. You know, the weaponry they've got, the training they've had, you know, the intelligence that they've been given has, you know, undoubtedly been a major factor in allowing them, you know, to do the counterattack. But, you know, their main strength is not in the weaponry. It's in their morale. It's the people themselves. They're fighting for their lives. They're fighting for their freedom. They're fighting for their country and against an opposition that is poor in morale, poor in information, which doesn't have the country essentially behind them at all, and, you know, against troops who don't really know what the objective is. They've been told that, you know, Ukraine is a down-at-heel, dissolute country run by Nazis, and what they found, of course, that is a civilized, modern European nation with higher standards of living than most of them have enjoyed in their own home territories.
Early on, it was very much like, this is David versus Goliath. Ukraine has no chance. And there was very much a, you know, there were words from the West, but they weren't necessarily sending much. Germany in particular had a lot of criticism. And now we're seeing this counteroffensive, and it feels like, again, the West has been surprised by the fact that Ukraine has been advancing. Has the West just been completely flummoxed by not only the fact that Russia couldn't completely overtake Ukraine, but now we're seeing a Ukrainian counteroffensive?
Well, I think a lot of people have been surprised by the tenacity of the Ukrainians, the pathetic nature of the Russian advance. You know, maybe we were, as we were in the Cold War, taken in by our own propaganda. You know, the Russian forces were nowhere near as good as they claimed they were, and as we perhaps sometimes thought that they were. You know, I think sometimes, frankly, you know, there's a weakness in intelligence, you know, a failure of intelligence, sometimes a failure of foresight. So, you know, maybe we in the future have got to think a bit more imaginatively about the kind of threats that we face and what we need to do about them.
And in terms of those threats, what have you learnt about modern warfare?
Well, we have learned about deterrence. Yes, you know, IEDs are a very primitive device that was used in Afghanistan against our military, despite the fact that we have very, very expensive, highly sophisticated weapons at our disposal. So you need to have a range of tools to be able to deal with it, you know, including diplomacy. You've got to try and work out what people are doing in advance, you know. So investing in intelligence and diplomacy is a crucial part of the way in which, in the future, we have to deal with it. You cannot underestimate you're a potential opposition. That's one of the lessons that we've learned from a lot of these battles. But at the same time, we've got to have the ability to deter. You know, a man in the street stopped me recently and said, "You used to run NATO." Got a long memory, this guy, but he said, "Why is it, you know, that we took on Milosevic and we're not taking on Putin?" And I said, "Well, it's actually very simple. He's got nuclear weapons. Milosevic didn't. You know, and nuclear deterrence is very much part of the balance that is here. I don't believe Putin even contemplates the possibility, the slightest possibility, of crossing the Article 5 line and attacking one of the NATO countries, because the nuclear deterrent is there. The motherland would be in danger."
Are you not worried, though, about having the referenda in Donetsk and Luhansk, the occupied regions? Isn't that what's going on there? Is that a play from Russia to sort of illegally say this is Russian territory, so that if there is any attack on those regions, they will claim that is Russian land?
That's a ploy, but it's a dishonest ploy, and it's also an incredible one as well. You know, the territory of Ukraine is there. It's on a map. They can't pretend simply because they have a false referendum or a fake referendum organised in wartime conditions that they can claim that is then
But
Russian
they did it
territory.
with Crimea.
They did, but it's still not. Crimea is still not Russian. You know, by any international standard, Crimea is still not Russian. It's part of the sovereign territory of Ukraine. So, you know, it would be a ploy, but it's not something that is going to actually cut the mustard.
Putin has had criticism in recent days from the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, who had questions and concerns. India's Narendra Modi said today's era is not an era of war. Yet Putin is doubling down. Why is that?
We don't know if he's doubling down at all. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, you know, and we won't know until the last minute. You know, gradually, you know, it's not just Prime Minister Modi and President Xi who are expressing concerns. You know, we saw 60 municipal councillors calling for Putin to resign. We saw Mr. Kadyrov, the fairly brutal ruler of Chechnya, expressing concerns. We see military bloggers, you know, from the right, the nationalist right, being heavily critical of the mess that's been created.
Do you think NATO is still far too reliant on America? I mean, you were critical earlier talking about America's approach to Russia in the 2000s under the Bush administration. Do you think NATO as an alliance is still reliant on America? It's still too big a voice, still too much funding comes from there, and Europe at some point needs to stand alone in its own defense?
Well, Europe needs to stand more strongly in its own defense, not alone, because being part of an alliance of free nations is hugely important, and having the United States of America and Canada involved in NATO gives it a unique strength and solidarity. After all, Article 5 was designed to make sure that America would come to the aid of Europe if what happened twice in the 20th century happened.
And given what we were talking about earlier in terms of what we've learned about modern warfare, would NATO win a war if it came to that?
Of course it would. You only have to add up the collective military power that exists in the NATO countries, and it overwhelms anything that Russia or China or any other enemy could do. So yes, it would. And it's also got the basis of the nuclear deterrent. Now, that's designed not to be used. In fact, President Putin last year, along with the other nuclear powers, reiterated that pledge that a nuclear war must never be fought, because that is existential. It's a threat to the individual countries and to the world as a whole, but it's there to make sure that people don't step across a line. And that line is a very, very important one.
And finally, where do you see the Ukraine war, if you can, ending?
Well, it ends when the Ukrainian people believe that it should end. And it ends with the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, when that happens, how it happens, I can't foresee. All I know at the present moment is that we must help the Ukrainian people with their desire and their demand to stay alive and to stay as an independent nation state. That's the priority. The longer term will look after itself, but that's the immediate objective, that Russia must stop fighting and the Ukrainians must win.
Lord Robertson, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.